resilience, particularly in a business context, and I think just in life in general, I really feel that resilience had just become synonymous with coping. And I guess just by definition, it's about recovering, and it's about, I hate the phrase bouncing back but that's the thing you hear so often. But to me, that implies you just keep coming back to where you were and just coping and surviving. And I don't see resilience as that at all. I really see resilience as how you grow.
Welcome to the follow-up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore what it means to find common ground at a time when it feels increasingly harder to do so, to listen more than we speak so that we can understand that our differences don't have to divide us. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before, so that you can then take that new knowledge and apply it to your ability to empathize with the people around you. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we truly reveal what connects us as humans. Our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and who we truly are. Let's talk about resilience for a moment. When I say the word resilience, what comes to mind? If you think about the last 18 months of our existence as people living on this earth, I guess depending on your view of the world, either we are more resilient than ever because of what has happened, or this is exposing our lack of resiliency. And by this, of course, I'm talking about the COVID-19 pandemic. In case you're listening to this episode 3 years down the road, let's say in 2024, 2025, and we're past all this. Here's hoping, right? If you ask today's guest here on the show, resilience is all about how we describe a situation, how we look at it, our view of it, and how we experience what's going on, not only happening to us, but happening in the world around us. I gotta believe Stacey Copas knows a thing or two about resilience. You see, Stacey was paralyzed in a diving accident as a child. And if there's anyone who understands what it means to be resilient and not give up and see that there is a future, it might just look a little bit different than what we used to know or what we thought our future would look like, it's Stacey. For Stacey, resilience looks like self-awareness. It looks like reliance on others, on a community of people. It looks like art and culture and music all coming together to change your outlook on a certain situation. But one thing is for sure as you hear Stacey's story today, resilience is not going back to the way things were. That's simply not possible, especially for Stacey, who is now bound to a wheelchair. Resilience is about becoming who you are meant to be, whether it is in spite of your circumstances or because of it. You've put yourself in a position as a public speaker and delivering in a very public way talks about resiliency and leadership and your life. The question that immediately comes to mind for me is, do you ever get tired of telling your story?
What's really interesting about that is when I first ventured into this space, it was one of the questions I did ask other speakers was, do you ever either feel disconnected from your story after telling it so many times, or do you get sick of it? And it was interesting because a lot of people, there was varying questions, like varying answers to that. But what I've found is that by telling my story, particularly with a live audience, and being able to see how they connect to that story has actually got me more connected to my story than I ever was before. And that was something I wasn't expecting. I was expecting to get that, oh, okay, I'm a bit over this. But just every audience and seeing the response and the way that they open up energetically as I share my story, that was something that's so incredibly powerful. And I really didn't realize how much was in that, because I know when I first wanted to explore speaking, I didn't want to tell my own story. And I was very fortunate that I had a mentor at the time that said, you've got to get over yourself. It's not about you. And being Australian, the tall poppy thing is huge here. Mm-hmm. And because I said to him, I said, Pat, I don't want to tell my story because everyone's going to think I'm a total wanker for talking about myself. and he said, no. He said, look, with a story like yours and the lessons you've learned and how you've turned your life around, he said, if you don't share your story, you're being selfish. And I was just like, whoa, I was floored in that moment. And this was in a room of people too. It wasn't just a one-on-one conversation. So from that, I thought, how could I argue with that? And then after, the first time that I shared, a 5-minute version of my story on stage, and then for the next 2 days at this event, I had people just coming up and, constantly, and people said, I laughed and I cried in 5 minutes. Like, this was just so powerful. So I think that was a really great lesson. Is, again, it wasn't about me, and yeah, instead a surprise that the connection to the story became even richer for it.
What has the last, I'll call it 18 months, been like now? You said so much of that was driven by the live audience interaction and the ability to see the emotion on people's faces, because we wear our emotions. What has the last 18 months been like for you then to not have that?
Wow, it was really rough to start with, and I was one of these people that thought, I'm just going to bunker down for a bit and just see what happens. I absolutely did not want to do virtual stuff. That was something I'm like, my whole intention as a speaker is connection over content, and to have, and I feel that I do both well. But connection was my thing, and it was just, I thrived off it, and an audience thrived off that eye contact and, as I said, sharing that energy in a room. And so, once sort of March hit last year, it was everything I had booked for 2020 got cancelled or postponed indefinitely. And as I said, I just sort of thought, no, look, I'm just going to sit it out. But part of me at the beginning was like, oh, resilience, this is a great time. There's a really good opportunity here. But thankfully, I did just sit back for a little bit, and I did have, one of my business coaches had said, okay, too soon. And then I just sat back and waited. And I did just do some Zoom stuff. I opened up what I called like a virtual drop-in center every day for about 3-4 months for half an hour. And I just posted it around my socials. I said, look, I know everyone's sort of probably feeling a little bit lost at the moment, and, all this social distancing that people were talking about. And I said, no, we need to be socially connected more than ever. So let's get together. So I was having all those little small group conversations, but it just wasn't the same. And I think the real biggie was just the lack of ability to make eye contact, properly. I think that's one of the big things I missed. But eventually I ended up, I had people ask me, look, can you come and just do a 10-15 minute little guest speaker spot on one of their events, and I ended up doing a lot of international stuff that way. So, but I still wasn't loving it. But then I realised through speaking with other speakers that there was actually a real opportunity to create an even greater sense of intimacy for an audience member through virtual. But it is just really hard work as a speaker presenter, because you've got to give so much more in this space, but I'm doing it to a screen. And I think the thing that I realised that really that hurt the most was the end of a keynote, because typically that's my high point, because I'm so excited that I've had this amazing connection, and then I'm often, even if I do an opening keynote, I'll be there. I'll be one of the last people to leave at the end of the day, because I love to just stay and continue those conversations and hear people's stories and hear what questions they've got and what resonated with them. And so what was my high point ended up becoming the lowest point, because I might have felt that, I felt that if I had the opportunity where people had their videos on and I could get a little bit of a sense of how they were responding in real time. But then it was, the person would wrap it up and it was like blank screen. And I'd be just like, there was a few times I just sat in my room and cried, because I was like, this is terrible. But then again, it had to come back to that whole thing. It's not about me. Like, the further we got into this pandemic stuff, the more I realized I was needed. And so I had to just really put so much into making sure I was capable and energetically charged enough to be able to deliver that, and know by I started to do to try and, in a way, kind of replicate that interaction after the fact was I've set up a designated email address, and I would say to people, okay, like, send me an email here, like, what was the one thing you took away? And so I could sort of start some conversations that way, which was good, but it just isn't the same as being in a room full of people. And the other thing is too is for most speakers is that's how we get a lot of our work, is the conversations that happen in that, especially in that hour or two after you've just delivered a keynote.
Does it strike you as ironic that someone who talks about resiliency was struggling to be resilient to face the changes that we were all dealing with?
Yeah, look, for me, I recognized that I needed to sit back for a while and observe myself, because I'm probably better equipped than anybody to deal with what's going on at the moment. And so, also, I don't have children. I don't have staff. I didn't have a lot of the other pressures that other people were struggling with as well. So I sort of thought, well, look, if I'm somebody that is really good in this space, I thought it would be really a good thing in self-awareness, and I think self-awareness is a really big part of resilience as well, is I thought it would be a good thing for me to sit back and observe myself. And then through that lens going, well, okay, if I'm responding in this way, then how would people be responding, reacting, not coping, that type of thing, if they had all of those other resources and perhaps they didn't have that particular, positivity, optimistic bias that I already had. So it was such a great lesson in that, and I just sort of thought, look, I had to sort of get over that fear of that, the loss or the scarcity part of it from a financial perspective, and go, look, this is such a really valuable learning experience. And there's still times where, I lose my crap, and I've had times where I sit and have a cry and I do all these things, but then I think that's a big thing, is like resilience also looks like that. And it's recognizing that often when those things happen, it's because I haven't been consistent with my rituals for resilience. And so again, it's great to learn through self-observation and then being able to then translate that and share that with others too.
I'd love to give the audience at this point some context into your particular brand of resilience and your story. For lack of any other question, what happened, Stacey?
Oh, look, yes, I definitely come at resilience from a bit of a different angle than most. And it's funny because when I first started speaking about resilience, I didn't think I was qualified to speak about resilience because I wasn't an academic and I wasn't a psychologist. And but yeah, I come about it from life experience. And I guess the biggest challenge I've faced, and there's been a lot of them along the way, but the biggest one I faced is when I was 12 years old. I was an athlete back then. I was the pitcher in the softball team. I was the first girl to play soccer for my school, and I was a rep runner from every distance, from the 100 right through to the cross country. And academically really talented, and so many things were going on in my life that were so positive, and I knew exactly what I wanted to do with my life, and everything was on track. But yeah, it was a first weekend in summer here in Sydney, and I was at a relative's place with my younger brother who was 10 and a couple other boys that similar age, and so we were just cooling off in their backyard pool, and it was an above ground pool, so not that deep. And I did whatever, like every time I visited there, I sort of thought I didn't want anything to do with the boys. It's just like, boys, and you're little. And so I just I kept climbing up onto the edge of the pool and diving in, and I just did this over and over again, and I was getting yelled at to stop, but being 12 and invincible at that stage, it's like, I'm not going to listen to that. You're going to spoil my fun. And so I stood there, and there was this one particular time, it was probably a bit of perfectionism kicking in early, and I stood on the edge, and I thought that I was splashing too much as I was diving in. So I stood there for a moment, and I thought, how could I make a better dive without splashing so much? So I thought, in theory, if I was to sort of hold my feet together and try and keep my legs straighter, I thought that would make a cleaner dive. So I thought, great, figured this one out, took a deep breath, and I dived in doing exactly that. And it felt like every other dive that I'd done up until that point, until I went to try and swim up to the surface, and I realized I couldn't move. So I was completely conscious. I didn't feel any pain. I didn't feel like anything had gone wrong. I just couldn't move. So I was holding my breath. Panic obviously set in very quickly, and I was trying to get the attention of my brother, which I couldn't do. So I held my breath for as long as I could, but there's only so long I could hold it for, and then I had to just give in. And as I sort of gave in and my lungs filled with water, I blacked out. And eventually my brother realised something was wrong. They just thought I was mucking around. It was actually interesting. It was only a couple of years ago. I had lunch with one of the other kids, who's now in his late 30s, who was in the pool with me that day. And I hadn't seen him since that day, 29 years in between. And I had lunch with him and his wife and his mum, and reflected on the day. And he said, "Oh, we just thought you were mucking around. We were literally splashing at you." And so that was really interesting to have that conversation, 29 years later. So yeah, eventually they raised the alarm for help and pulled me out. And it was, later that night in hospital, at the third hospital I was taken to. So ambulance, helicopter, ambulance. And the doctor came and told me that I'd actually broken my neck and drowned, and that I'd never walk again. So to go from being that fiercely independent, driven, active young woman to being told that was it. It was like I literally felt like my life, was over at that time.
Do you know how you broke your neck? Did your head hit the bottom of the pool? What actually caused the paralysis?
Yeah, so the only reason I know is because I actually ended up with I had a bruise. Apparently I had a bruise above my right eyebrow. So what had happened is, in that keeping the legs straight and is I'd obviously gone almost straight down. And so, those above ground pools, they're probably only about 4 foot deep or something like that. And I was very tall. I was 5'6" by the time I was 11. So the math doesn't work very well there. But yeah, so apparently what had happened is I'd hit my head, and it was the impact of that just forced two of the vertebrae in my neck to pinch part of the spinal cord between it. And so, I have what they would say is an incomplete spinal cord injury now, which I feel I'm incredibly blessed, and I have a lot more movement and function. I can feel everything than most quadriplegics do, but ultimately it's left me a quadriplegic. And now I'm coming up to 31 years since that happened. So but I'm pretty grateful for how I've sort of ended up after that. But certainly wasn't a lot of gratitude in the early days, that's for sure.
And that's where I want to go, Stacey. Like it strikes me. How do you begin to overcome that kind of trauma? How do you begin to sort through all the different areas of your life that have now so radically changed? Yeah, that's the question. How do you begin to sort through the trauma?
Yeah, I don't know that there was any, specific intentional way of doing that. Really, in the beginning, it was a lot of anger. There's a lot of anger and resentment and bitterness and all of that stuff. And because, everything I saw myself as and saw myself becoming, I saw at that time was gone. And I think at that stage, I was 12, so I'd just finished my primary schooling here. I was about to go into high school. And, it's such a formative part of identity and things like that at that age. So, and I ended up spending 7 months in hospital. So I missed the first half of, year 7. I couldn't go to the school I was meant to go to, and I'd actually gotten into a very academically competitive, selective agricultural school. I wanted to be a vet. So, and I couldn't do that. And I ended up, being sent to a school nowhere near where I lived, where I didn't know anybody in the middle of the year, 3 days out of hospital. So I felt like the universe had it in for me at that point in time. But yeah, I really internalized a lot of it. I was just really good at getting on with life face. But I, through the teen years, as I said, didn't really know where I fitted, didn't know where I was going to go. I spent a lot of those especially the sort of first 4 years of high school, getting drunk and getting stoned, and they were my little outlets. And I look at it now and it's like, moments of artificial happiness really was what was going on there. But in between it was it was getting darker. But again, I just kept it all to myself. I was incredibly stubborn, and certainly not a resilient thing to do is internalize it and not get help. But yeah, it was just over time. I ended up changing schools, and then going from being in this, what they called it wasn't like a special school or anything like that, but there was a stack of kids with disabilities there. And then I went to a school that was closer to home, where I was only one or two in the whole school. And my brother had started there 2 years younger. It was an academically selective school as well. And so yeah, it was like, that was pretty cool. But I think I didn't realize until in the last year or so that one of the biggest things that got me through that period and started I think to just get me back on track was music. And like, I've always loved music and immersed in music, like as a consumer. And I realized that those teen years, like, music was the thing. I was very, very fortunate to be at the lowest points of my life in the early to mid 90s at the height of grunge. and it was just the perfect soundtrack for, as I said, the angry, angsty, all of that stuff going on. Like, it was perfect. And so, yeah, I used to just, I'd be in my room listening to music, and I just found that music gave me a way to express myself that I didn't have the words or the capacity to do. I think just from an energetic vibrational perspective, it just helps to shift that energy. And then eventually I started going to live music. And so I went to my first concert in 1991, 92, Red Hot Chili Peppers.
I was going to ask who it was.
Red Hot Chili Peppers on the Blood Sugar Sex Magic tour at the Sydney Entertainment Centre, and I would have been 13, I think.
Yeah.
And that just became a bit of an addiction to me, and so that was what charged me. And the beauty of going and seeing live music is it just gave me a bit of a sense of community and connection. I think there's such a unique culture around rock music specifically. And it's, it's such a diverse range of people and a diverse audience, but it's a type of audience where I think everyone looks out for each other and everyone's connected and everyone's there for that common purpose. And just the energy of it, just, really, really loud music that sort of hits you in the chest with the bass. And it was just so good. So I think that was a really big part for me was immersing in music. And it's and now in the last year I ended up, taking singing lessons and doing that sort of stuff. And I'm really immersed in music even deeper than I ever have before. And it's been so powerful.
My first concert was around the same age, at about age 13, and it was a Kiss concert on their reunion tour. So I understand the thump of the bass of a rock concert. I get that feeling.
Yeah, I have seen Kiss. It's one of those things as a music fan. I think there's certain bands you need to see in your life, whether you really like them or not.
Yeah.
And I actually took my mum to see Kiss for Mother's Day one year here in Sydney. And and it was a local Australian act that opened, and Grunspoon, and it was great. Like again, for a spectacle and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yep.
Kiss is pretty good.
That's hilarious. I want to go back to something you said with that initially early on, a lot of the anger was internalized. What were those conversations like within yourself, in your head? What were the things that you were telling yourself, and what were your conversations like with yourself?
Yeah, it was a lot of it was there was a lot of definitely beating yourself up. So a lot of it was I at that time there was so much focusing on what I couldn't do anymore, and so and looking at it particularly, I think one of the biggest ones was the sporting thing. It was because like I said, I'm ultra competitive pretty much in anything I do. But sport was the biggie. And so I was really, really angry that I couldn't play sport like I used to. So much so that when I was first in hospital, and I spent 8 weeks flat on my back at that time, and I made a pact with my 12-year-old self that I was never, ever going to play sport again if I couldn't play it like I used to, because I couldn't be good at it. And if I can't be good at something, I don't want to do it. So there was an element of that. There was for me, like I was one of these. I was interested in boys very early, and so there was a lot of resentment, just sort of thinking, "Geez, no boy's ever going to be interested in me again." That was a biggie. So that really, there was that. So it's just sort of, and just thinking, what am I? What's the point? I can't do all these things, and I can't be a vet now. Like it was just, there was just so much of all, and it was all on what I can't do anymore, and just losing that independence. So for me, it was like I said, being such an independent person, and then needing to have help to get dressed and go to the bathroom and get in and out of bed and do all these things. There wasn't really a sense of being alone too much, and that was really challenging. So I said, like, so much of it was just focused on that anger, and really for those first couple of years, like I would have given anything to probably turn back the clock, not taken that dive, or to have not even just been alive at all, because I just sort of thought, well, again, what's the point? I can't do anything really. That was where my mind was at. And so that was really challenging. And I just had something just popped in and out of my mind so quickly then that I was going to go to, and it just, so my train of thought derailed. There were no survivors. But there was something in that sort of space as well that I was going to go to. But I'm sure, again, these things come back when they're meant to, don't they?
Sure, they absolutely do. It happens more often than not. 30, almost 31 plus years removed from this now, and hearing that the self-destructive kind of coping mechanisms, the self-talk that you just described, I'm sure you get asked all the time what resiliency is. But I want to ask you, what is resiliency not?
Yeah. Resiliency is not blaming. It's not getting angry. It's not beating yourself up. Resiliency is it's not looking after yourself. And resiliency is not isolating yourself. It's resiliency. I sort of feel that it's interesting to flip it around, isn't it? It's to go, okay, well, what's the flip side of all these things? Resiliency is, I think, coming back to the blame. Resiliency isn't making excuses. Resiliency isn't outsourcing your responsibility and everything to something external.
I asked that question, Stacey, in the context of everything that we're going through right now. And everything that you just said, I see it in our actions. Are we resilient enough as a human race to deal with all the things that we're dealing with right now?
I definitely feel that the last 18 months has shone a spotlight into the lack thereof of resilience. Also, too, I look at it too, is I feel just before all this stuff happened, I feel that resilience, particularly in a business context, and I think just in life in general, I really feel that resilience had just become synonymous with coping. And I guess just by definition, it's about recovering, and it's about, I hate the phrase bouncing back, but that's the thing you hear so often. But to me, that implies you just keep coming back to where you were and just coping and surviving. And I don't see resilience as that at all. I really see resilience as how you grow. I love just describing it as, I see resilience as how we grow through challenge. It's how we learn and we grow and we adapt and we become stronger by setbacks and by disappointments and things like that. But I definitely feel that I see so much of a lack of it, and that's something that I sort of feel a bit of responsibility to sort of step up in this time and highlight to people. It's like, okay, yep, this has been rough, and I feel that the pandemic has given people a little bit of a taste of what it's like to have their lives changed in an instant and feeling like they have no control over it, and just the overwhelming uncertainty, because I think that that's what a lot of people are struggling with. But the thing that I'm really trying to get through to people is, first of all, stop watching the news. Stop sitting back and waiting for the government or the media to tell you what to do. Take some ownership of your own life. Look, I get overwhelmed by it at times too, because there's so much I see of it that frustrates me. And but again, and that's where I have to come back to my own personal responsibility, and it is a big one. But I think the thing is like we've dealt with we've had the setbacks, we've had the disappointments, but ultimately, like, I look at it, we're in the ultra marathon of all ultra marathons, and there is no finish line in sight. But we've got to keep moving. We have to just keep moving. We need to come back to, well, what do we want in our own lives, and quit sort of getting caught up by the external noise. It's such a big one. I think also too, even prior to the pandemic, I think the pandemic is just, as I said, just put the spotlight squarely on these things. I think generationally, that's where I start to feel old. But I feel the much younger people, and I see it through my work, and I with a lot of business leaders having a lot of issues with younger people in the workplace and their lack of resilience. And we've ended up with the everyone gets a trophy generation. And so they've thought, okay, we need to not be hard on kids. We need to build kids' self-esteem. But unfortunately, the pendulum has swung way too far to you're amazing, you can do anything. Let's give you everything on your Christmas list, and we don't keep score anymore in our sports, and you don't get ranked on your report cards because that could be bad for your self-esteem. And now I've got clients now that have got a very young workforce that are just tearing their hair out with people that just are really not coping with life, let alone actually being able to show up and be responsible people in their workforces.
For you, how did you begin to build resiliency? You said it started with music and that gave you the outlet of expression and just getting the feelings out. But how did you begin to build the resiliency within yourself to the point where now you're seeing this and speaking about it? You're seeing this in others. You're speaking about it. You're helping people build resiliency yourself. What's your story?
Look, it was something that I didn't feel like I consciously did. It was one of those things that, like so many people that end up doing things like I do, it was people outside of me that saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. And so it was only, the mentor that said about sharing my story and how I needed to do that. That was only 10 years ago that I started on that journey of realizing there was something bigger that I needed to be doing rather than just getting on with life. But people were always saying to me, like, Stacey, how did you end up being so positive and optimistic and all these things? And I'm just like, no, nothing to see here. Move right along. It was the little old me syndrome that I look at. Even the word resilient, resilience was never a word that I can ever remember using prior to, another mentor that actually put the label to it. And she goes, like, this is the perfect description for how you can, reverse engineer how you went from, those lowest to the lows to all the things that I'd achieved. And it was funny because I didn't feel like I really had anything to talk about. I didn't think there was anything special about me or what I'd done. And what's really interesting too is, people would say, oh, you're inspiring. And, the word inspirational came up a lot. And what's really interesting about the word inspirational is I'm not quite sure what it's like internationally, but here in Australia, I felt the word got bastardized by some of the sections of the disability community because they would call this inspiration porn and all this sort of stuff, and this whole thing about you're not inspiring just because you're out doing something normal. And so I felt really uncomfortable with even being called an inspirational speaker to start with. And so it was a matter of then looking, and I said reverse engineering, like how did I get from there to where I was? And then I looked at it and I'm like, okay, I've actually done way more than most people have, disability or not. And so then I started to feel a little bit more comfortable with it. But then it was just, again, so I'm really looking, it's like, well, how did I do it? Because again, so much of it was really unconscious. It was just things that I kind of did instinctively rather than, I wasn't out reading self-help books back then. I wasn't working with counselors. I wasn't working with coaches. All of that stuff came in my 30s. Up until that point, I was just going by that internal navigation. And so when I looked at it, I said, yeah, music was a big part of it. Focusing on what I had rather than what I'd lost, and the language around things. Because I feel that so often people and all of us do it, and I know I'm bad. I'm even now I have to pull myself up on it. If I start to describe something that's going on, and I'm like, hang on, you're awfulizing it or you're catastrophizing it, and so then just pulling it back and going, well, okay, is it devastating or is it just merely disappointing? And and just the energy around how that feels when you did that. So recognizing that the way that we describe an experience, like just describe a situation, is how we experience a situation. But one of the biggies that I feel it's really become the centerpiece of just who I am and how I relate to people and how I share things is it comes back to gratitude. And ultimately the biggest change, and I cannot pinpoint exactly when it was, but when I decided that the accident was going to change my life for the better, not for the worse, and I began to feel grateful for what had happened and the opportunities that had presented to me, that was the big shift. And it was, I couldn't change what had happened or anything like that, but I could change how I felt about it. I could change the story I told about it, and I could change what I did next. So, gratitude now is, it's probably one of my biggest rituals around resilience, and it's one of the things that I teach people straight up. It's like any situation you're in, if you're feeling overwhelmed or anything by it, it's like starting with thank you, and not this, go and write down 5 things you're grateful for today in your gratitude journal. So, not a fan. I find it a little bit wanky, and I think it kind of is a bit of a chore, and it's kind of becomes a bit of an obligation. And I don't know, it doesn't create an experience of gratitude for me. And the more I've sort of spoken about that, the more people go, yeah, I didn't really like that either, and it really didn't work for me. So now I decided to come back to a gratitude mantra, and it started out just going, 3 questions, and again, 3 steps and a couple of questions it was, is, say thank you, then ask what's the opportunity or what's the lesson, and then how could this help somebody else? But I was able to really just simplify it down in any situation to go, thank you for the opportunity to be who I am, where I am, with what I have at this moment in time. And that one now is that's the last thing I say to myself when I go to sleep of a night, and it's the first thing I say to myself when I wake up every morning. And if I'm in that situation where I feel like everything's a bit overwhelming, then I come back to that as well. So, and eventually over time, when I really started to get into speaking and then writing my book and doing that, then I really started to go, well, okay, what other things were there? And I ended up sort of pulling together, 9, key principles that I realized were the things that helped to build my resilience. And so it's been interesting. That's evolved. Like I first did the first version of that framework, probably 2011, 2012, mainly around 2012. And, now it's, I said it's evolved over the last 18 months. The last 18 months have been incredible for being able to really reflect on, what resilience is to me and how it's evolved. And I said now I speak a lot about the rituals around resilience and just the really simple practices that help us to build that. And again, I think rituals are incredibly powerful, particularly in times of such uncertainty, because resilience are controllable, they're predictable, and they're repeatable. So they're things that we can actually use to create a little bit of certainty when there isn't a lot going on outside of us.
Right. Stacey, something you said there that I wrote down was how we describe a situation is how we experience a situation. I know that you're not a fan of sarcasm.
Yes.
Do you believe that our words manifest outcomes for us?
I totally believe that. I totally believe it. And I've had so many experiences in my life where that has happened. And I know that the sarcasm thing that you're referring to is a particular experience I had, where I had a bit of a disaster on a very public platform when I was competing in athletics. I did end up, after that, making that pact with that 12-year-old self that I was never going to play sport again. I actually kept that pact up, other than I got pushed to try a couple of things over the years, but I was just so embarrassed by how slow and uncoordinated I was. I thought that was a good decision to not play sport. And I kept that packed up for 22 years. Like, it's a pretty stubborn 12-year-old. And I ended up taking up sports at 34, got referred to as a mature age athlete at the time. But yeah, I ended up getting to the point where I was competing at a national level in athletics. So I did the 100 meters and I did the discus. And I actually, in the 100 meters, like, I ended up being the first woman in Australia to ever compete in my classification. In the T51. But yeah, I had a really public disaster, and so I looked at it, and when I reverse engineered it, I realized I had manifested the entire situation. Like, I joked that the wheelchair was a shopping trolley. I joked that I was going to do the slowest 100 meters in history, that the 100 meters is over way too slow, so I'm going to make it last a bit longer. And then, my competitor, I said, "Oh, make me a cup of tea while you're waiting for me at the other end." And, I ended up, it probably is the slowest 100 meters ever done at a at an internationally ranked event. And so when I looked back and saw that whole thing, I realized that I had manifested the entire situation, because the universe doesn't get sarcasm. The universe doesn't get what you don't want. I think one of the other ones that, really got me was, I think back in the, I think it was early days of internet dating and stuff like that. Internet dating forces you to create criteria, even if you don't really have a lot. And the one that I found myself saying was, I found myself saying all the things that I didn't want. And so my top 3 things I did not want in a relationship at the time, this is back in sort of 2005, 2006, as I said, I didn't want anyone that was any more than 10 years older than me. I didn't want anyone that had kids, and I didn't want to date another work colleague. And I ended up marrying the trifecta. And then I'm now divorced. So it's one of those things that, again, the universe didn't hear the not. It just heard, 10 years older than you, kids and a work colleague. Perfect. Here it is for you. So I do really get people to pull themselves up on the sarcasm, because, as I said, just by actually articulating those words, even if you are doing it in some kind of joking way, you'll end up getting you get what you ask for. The universe doesn't get the tone in which we say things. All it hears is, it's like the nouns. So the universe just gets the nouns. It doesn't get the how or the inflection or anything like that, or the gesturing or the posturing around it. It just gets the words. So if you've got the conversations going either in your own mind or with other people, but yeah, I just find the sarcasm piece is, and it's funny when I share those stories around sarcasm, I just sort of see so many people's faces go, oh.
In the same, or in a parallel vein, I'll say, something you wrote about recently, or perhaps said, was there is a time to question and there's a time not to question. What did you mean by that? What are those times?
Yeah, the context in which that came up for me was going back to the sporting thing, and that's where I sort of found those words falling out of my mouth. It was when I was 34 and I decided to go back and pursue sports. It was just a couple of days after my 34th birthday that I just got the strongest urge that it was time to get fit, and it said that urge was so strong, and I had no idea where it came from. But that was when I realized, when something comes through so clearly and so strongly, that again, there's a time to question and there's a time not to question. And that was one of those times where it was, I can't question this. It was just so strong. And so, and then it was interesting because I thought, okay, because I'd always been healthy, but I hadn't been fit. Like, I hadn't done any exercise. I hadn't been in a gym since I was in rehab, in the very early days. That was it. And so I thought, okay, well, maybe I might just do this. And yeah, it was a couple of days after that urge came that I got an email about a Paralympic talent search. And I thought, oh, that could be a good place to go to find something to get fit. And it was just one of those things. I realized that when those intentions come through so hard and so strongly, and that we need to pay attention to them rather than pushing them aside. And that was when, I just realized that once you do listen to those things, then in a way the universe conspires to help us make things happen. And that was definitely what had happened, for me in that moment.
You mentioned right there, paying attention to those intentions as they come in. You mentioned earlier observing yourself in those early days, especially. You even made the comment that self-awareness is a huge part of resiliency. How does someone adopt more of a mentality of looking inward at themselves, as uncomfortable or as perhaps upsetting as it might be? How do we do that?
Yeah, there's a few things that we can do with that. And a lot of this stuff has become something I do a lot more now. And I think because generally, for the most part, we have an instinct to just run away from anything that feels uncomfortable, especially something that's emotionally uncomfortable. And particularly when we're reflecting on ourselves and that it might be a feeling of being, sad or upset or any of these type of things. And the thing I've learned is now to actually sit with the feeling. And like I'm as bad as anybody I'm a doer. Like this is one thing I've realized. I've always been a doer, and these last 18 months have helped me become more of a beer, and to just be and experience things and sit with them, even just starting by just sitting with them just for a minute or a minute longer than what you would have, and then slowly building up that tolerance to it. But I think the biggest thing that's helped me to become more self-aware than anything else is journaling. And so I started keeping an evening journal. It must have been the first time I started doing it as an adult. It was only about 8 or 9 years ago. And I just sort of started by just wanting to capture what was the best thing that happened in that day, and just committed to write a sentence. But over the years now, I haven't missed a night in 6 years. It's my non-negotiable, and I look forward to it every night now. And some nights I've written over 3,000 words because I keep it electronically. And I've written up to 3,000 words in a night. 3,000, a couple of thousand words is not uncommon for me now. And it ultimately just starts as, what was the highlights of the day, but also just digging into, a little bit of almost like a bit of a daily log of the day. But as I sort of dig into things and I start to question it, or what I find is that I often reflect on situations that happened during the day, or perhaps thoughts that I had, or things that often it's the things you're not happy with during the day that you focus on in those moments. But then I started to write my way out of it. And I truly believe we can write our way out of any challenge. Now, in the past, I was like, I don't want to write. I hate writing. And I had to learn to love writing in order to become an author. And so, I find just writing is a really great way. So I find now that, it starts as a debrief for myself. Then I start to question certain things. And then you do a lot of reframing. And so, I sort of mentioned earlier that, the whole thing about we can't change what's happened, but we can change the story we tell about it, and we can change what we do next. And I find through the process of journaling every evening, then we have a chance to do that every day, because often we let situations go for a really long time, and they can really become a negative burden for us. But if we reflect on all situations as they happen, and that we are happy with the lens and the story we tell about it, by the time we go to bed that night, it's so liberating to be able to do that. So, and I think that's the thing, is we learn so much about ourselves through doing that. And I heard someone tell me years ago that, the only way forward is inward. And that has stuck with me so much. And I feel that particularly probably one of the biggest gifts in the last 18 months is that with so much stuff going on outside of us that seems almost impossible, that the only option we have is to go within. And I think with everything that's going on, I think it's the universe, source, God's way, wherever people's belief structures are. I feel it's that the universe's way of actually forcing us to do that when most people have never done it before.
Stacey, with the work that you do and the very public nature of your story now, I'm sure you get asked the same question over and over again, but I want to ask you, what's a question that you wish you were asked more?
I think right now, from everything I've been seeing, particularly in the last couple of years, and also through the work I do in workplaces, I would really love people to ask more about how they can actually better engage with people that have opposing views or that they don't particularly get along with. Because what has really stood out to me so much, particularly in the last 18 months, and particularly on two particular subjects, politics and the pandemic, that it has divided people in a way that I've never seen people divided before. And I've seen it in people I'm close to that are like, if you are the other side of politics, then I'm going to delete you. If you have a different view on what's happening from a pandemic perspective, then again, I'm going to block you, or I'm going to do all these things. And the thing that I've done is I have chosen to come from a place of love and compassion, and to just make sure that I'm not going to let opposing views get in the way. And I think the other angle on that is I'm hearing from a lot of leaders in business that they, particularly with the younger employees, they have people that don't particularly get along with someone that they're working with, so they just quit their job because they just don't have the ability to be alongside somebody every day that they don't like. And I'm just thinking, in a world where there is so much division and so much of it is orchestrated, then really more than ever we need to be able to come from a place of love and compassion and empathy, and to be able to relate to people regardless of what their beliefs are.
Beautifully put, and that is a beautiful place to end it, Stacey. So how can people connect with you and follow along with your work, Stacey?
Yeah, I'm Stacey Copas on all of the socials, staceycopas.com. And I'm most active on LinkedIn and Instagram, and I manage all of my own socials. So if you send a message, you will get me directly. And I absolutely love those conversations, and even more than ever, considering we don't get to have them in person so much anymore. But I really welcome the connection. And I always love to hear what resonated with people and also what questions they have. And again, let's keep those follow-up questions going.
Let's keep them going. I think that's a perfect way to end it. Thank you so much. I've enjoyed this conversation, Stacey. Thank you for coming on and sharing your story.
Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful conversation.
I hope that as you listened to Stacey's story today, it offered you perhaps a little bit of perspective that you didn't have before listening to this episode. That's my goal with all of these episodes here on the follow-up question, and Stacey's story is no different. So many thanks to Stacey for sharing her story on the show today. Please do me and Stacey a huge favor and share this episode with someone you know who might find some value in listening to today's conversation. Share this episode with your network. Help spread the good word about the importance of asking more questions. And if you like the conversations with the amazing guests like Stacey that I have on the show each and every week, subscribe so that you never miss an episode. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always email me at michael@thefollowupquestion.com, or you can go to thefollowupquestion.com and reach out there. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question. And until then, keep asking questions.